Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel this morning, the former members of Congress. We are joined by Congressman Rodney Davis, Congresswoman Donna Edwards, and Congressman Charlie Dent for a great discussion about what we saw last week and what it portends for the rest of this session. I'm sure that people are full of questions, and we do have time at the end for them. So we'll be taking them in the chat, and we look forward to having the members answer your questions. I want to start by introducing Congressman Davis. He represented Illinois' 13th, which covered Central Illinois in the House of Representatives from 2013 to 2023. During his tenure, he served as ranking member of the Committee on House Administration in the last two Congresses, as well as the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Congresswoman Donna Edwards served in Congress for 8.5 years, representing Maryland's 4th congressional district. She is a trailblazer in her own right, the first African-American woman congresswoman elected in Maryland, which is my home state now. Her previous committee assignments include the House Transportation and Infrastructure and Science, Space, and Technology committees. And Congressman Charlie Dent represented Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania. At the time was the state's 15th congressional district from 2005 to 2018. And in the House, he served on the coveted House Appropriations Committee and led the House Committee on Ethics during the 115th Congress. He was previously co-chair of former members of Congress and Congressional Study Group on Europe, and separately the Congressional Study Group on Germany. Charlie and Donna are pals. Congressman Davis, it's wonderful to be with you. We're going to kick it off with a question for you. During the speakership election, we saw Speaker McCarthy and his allies cut some kind of a deal that is memorialized in some 3-page addendum that everybody is talking about, but the press and most of the members have not seen. These negotiators, Scott Perry and Congressman Shiproy and others, drove a hard bargain, but ultimately broke the logjam so that McCarthy could get the votes on the 15th ballot and become speaker. What do you think that secret deal could mean, and will anything in there potentially come back to haunt Speaker McCarthy?
There's one thing I found out in my 10 years in Congress, besides that Charlie and Donna are great people, is that nothing stays secret. So if there's some secret 3-page agreement that has conspiracy theorists about what that's going to mean to Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, then it'll eventually come out. But what I saw during that speaker's race was not the highlighted points and the media attention on the 20 at one point that were against Kevin. The untold story, and Charlie and I were on CNN together for multiple days, and I kept saying the untold story is the 200 Republicans that are now more united than I've ever seen, even when Charlie and Donna and I served together, to actually stick by Kevin McCarthy. That unification, I think, is going to have an impact. So regardless of what agreement exists, I think you can kind of see where Kevin McCarthy has allowed individuals to get named to committees that they might have gotten anyway, even without any negotiations. And those negotiations for committee assignments happen regardless of the speaker vote, as everyone on this call knows. Andrew Clyde getting appropriations. Because of a remap year and because we're taking the majority, we had a lot of appropriation slots. Andrew Clyde might have gotten appropriations anyway. So what did Kevin really give away? We're truly operating under a similar rules package that we did when we were in the majority the last time. Remember, it was Nancy Pelosi who created the most closed rules process that I've operated under in my 10 years.
Congressman Dent, how does the speaker balance the demands of the insurgents going forward? And there will be more, because that's what insurgents do. Speaker McCarthy gave in to some of them, which means that they will be more, they will be demanding more. They raise funds this way, they stay on TV this way. They're relevant with their base if they continue fighting. So there's no question that we anticipate them continuing to push back, no matter how united the moderate or non-moderate Kevin McCarthy allies remain. How how does he deal with their demands, particularly on these spending cuts, when there is no Senate majority for Republicans and there's a Democratic White House and none of these things are likely to be passed into law?
Well, first, I fear that the speaker's ability to function is going to be significantly more limited now. Placing 3 of the Freedom Caucus on the Rules Committee, I think, is a grievous error. That's the Speaker's Committee, and you're going to see stuff come to the House floor that will be could be potentially pretty nasty that members won't want to vote on. I think it'll be very hard for the Speaker to control that committee. It struck me too that, appointing, say, 2 to the Appropriations Committee who are part of the 20, just from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're rewarding bad behavior. You're rewarding 2. And then, as a former appropriator, you used to like to put people on that committee who are going to do one thing: vote for the appropriations bills, not just when they leave the House, but when you get the final deal with the Senate. And I question whether that will be able to happen, given some of those appointments. And you're not going to have a big margin for error here. The other thing I guess I'd say too, with respect to what's occurred, what was the main point there in your question, AB? You said about
their demands besides process. Their demands are specifically spending cuts, and they got their procedural demands. But in terms of their spending cuts, they're not going to get those.
Yeah, look, the expectations have been raised. Going back to a 2022 spending baseline, I don't think it's going to work, because you're going to have to deal with the House, the House appropriators, Republican appropriators, as well as the Armed Services Committee, that are not going to be able to, they won't take defense back to the 2022 level. It's just not going to happen. And of course, then there's something called the Senate that's probably not going to agree to this either. And then you've got to get through a president. So, I think it's just raising the expectation. Those guys are going to be furious when they find out they're not going to be able to have a 2022 spending level. And same thing with the debt ceiling. You want to marry this up with cuts. Well, that's all well and good, except what if the Senate Democrats and the president aren't going to negotiate? This is a hostage that cannot be taken, and you cannot shoot this hostage. You can't crash through the debt ceiling. It's ridiculous. I feel like what we're witnessing now is just a continuation of what we've seen since 2011, except the only difference is there are more members on the fringe and there's a smaller majority. So this problem gets even worse. I wish I had some happy news about this. Here's another one too. We're going to have votes on all the appropriations bills. I'm all for that. I think that's terrific. And open rules. The problem is, and Rodney, you remember this, every time we did an open rule, some Democrat's going to come up with a clever amendment: no funds shall be expended to, discriminate against LGBT people in federal contracting matters. Okay, we adopt the amendment. And then those same guys who want the open rules will say, oh, you must pull the bill off the floor, which is what they always do. Or no funds shall be expended. I'll give you another one for the Democrats they can offer. No funds shall be expended to deny an FDA-approved drug to be sent across state lines. Oh boy, there you go. I'm just saying, this is the kind of stuff that's going to happen. And it's so predictable. And there's going to be a lot of, I just think it's going to be a really rough year and a half for the Speaker. Hope he survives that long,
That is a good question. Do you envision a scenario during one of these kerfuffles you're describing? God forbid it's the debt limit debate, but it will be likely, where they tell McCarthy he's bowing too much to the Democrats or whatever's going on, where they do get enough votes to join with the Democrats and take him out. Do you envision a scenario like that?
Or
will they back down?
I don't know if they're going to try to move to vacate the chair. After this fight, I'd hope they wait a while before they do it. That'd be my first.
I'm saying, could you envision it maybe next fall? During a very high stakes thing like the debt limit.
Sure. Because what's going to happen too? It's going to upset those guys who just were part of this deal. There's going to be another omnibus. And people say, oh, it's terrible we have omnibuses. Well, we have omnibuses because the Senate can't move appropriations bills individually. So they stack up. So you get to the end of the year, and guess what? You have to marry them together, as many as you can. That's why you have an omnibus. And so the House can't control that by itself. So, that's what I'm kind of mystified by, that, these agreements on spending limits, debt ceiling, no omnibuses. Well, guess what? I hate to burst the bubble, but this stuff's going to happen.
That's a really good point. Congresswoman Edwards, this Congress, of course, House Democrats have a completely new leadership team, and the transition was impeccably seamless. I was completely stunned to see the way that Speaker Pelosi just passed the power that she's always said is taken and not given to the next generation. It was all done very quietly and calmly. And then once it became public, in such a united front. What is your assessment of how they're doing so far? And do you see any obstacles for Minority Leader Jeffries in the months to come in this volatile 118th Congress?
Well, I have to tell you, I mean, I was not surprised about the seamless transition. I think that Speaker Pelosi has actually been building and strengthening this particular leadership team over the last 2 years. And I don't want to say it was inevitable, but there were just not enough voices in any kind of opposition that could have been mounted. So it didn't surprise me. I do think that having a transition where you have the former Speaker Pelosi still around, and Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn, I think this leadership team gets the benefit of the bargain when it comes to, those quiet conversations about strategy and about things that they've learned over the years that will help to solidify the Jeffries team. I also think that Hakeem Jeffries is an incredibly skilled leader. And I mean, we could see that he has the gift of communication and oratory skills. And trust me, when you're in the minority, you need to be able to communicate a message that people will remember. And I also think that Democrats in the minority will be able to do, frankly, what they did under John Boehner and Paul Ryan, which was to leverage their minority, especially on these crucial bills, on a deal on the debt ceiling, on a deal on spending. That probably what undid both Boehner and Ryan was that he ended up having to cut a deal with Democrats because he had that recalcitrant, actually a larger number of recalcitrants. I think John Boehner lost 28 votes for Speaker. Paul Ryan, I think, lost 9, but they had much wider majorities to do that. But the governing challenge was the same. I think it's even more difficult, a more difficult governing challenge that McCarthy has. And Charlie, I'll have to tell you, this is a different group of people. I don't think they're going to wait very long before that motion to vacate. It may be put to bed, but I don't think that they're going to wait long because they get frustrated at even small things that they perceive are losses. And so my worry is that what will happen is that a deal has to be cut on the debt ceiling. It just does. We cannot crash the economy, not just our economy, but the world economy. That is just a fact. There's no negotiation on that. So there has to be a deal, and Democrats are going to be part of that. The spending, as I think, Charlie, as you described, many of those appropriations bills, even under Republican majorities, the Appropriations Committee did seem to work through its bills, and they hashed those things out. And it was not, they weren't necessarily all public fights, but they hashed them out and moved appropriations bills forward. Unless the House wants to have the Senate dictate the terms of every single thing that gets through, then McCarthy is going to have to figure out a way to come together with the moderates or his supporters within the party to join with Democrats to pass that must-pass legislation.
Okay, Congressman Davis, I'd like to know your opinion of whether you agree with the scenario described by Congresswoman Edwards. And then I'm going to move to the next question, but I'd just like you to weigh in, and Charlie can later if he wants to.
I served 10 years in Congress and was never on appropriations, but the appropriations process in the House was broken my entire career. We haven't seen an appropriations process work. So somehow thinking that this is new is just not accurate. The Senate has dictated our appropriations packages my entire career, and that's not going to change. But I think it's expectations, and it's It's expectations that we set when Nancy Pelosi became Speaker, and especially when she had a small majority. We had expectations that we set for more bipartisanship that did not take place. But the expectations that we're somehow going to get into regular order when it comes to appropriations, and that we're going to pass large bipartisan agreements in this Congress is not true. The expectation should be the oversight environment's going to take charge of the House of Representatives. No one should have ever expected big things to get done in divided government anyway. And it will be a slog on the debt ceiling, but it's not going to be much different than what we witnessed in the debt ceiling when I would watch Charlie stand up and conference and say, we need a clean debt ceiling. And then you had a majority of the conference at the time of Republicans saying, we got to have some leverage. Well, you know what? The majority of the conference now is Republicans are more energized to not take orders from those exotic members who are looking for attention and who look for attention with their speakers vote. So I think the Republican conference is in better shape to make sure that America doesn't default. And America's not going to default on its debt. And it's going to be a lot of coverage that they are, but it's not going to happen.
No, but I mean, even the threat of default in 2011 was enough to have us face a downgrade, and it cost taxpayers $1.3 billion. I mean, come on.
I wasn't there in 2011. I can only tell you from my time. I wasn't there in 2011 when we were there.
Charlie, you were there, and you could see it, and that was nasty. And even the threat of not paying our debt is enough to send, shockwaves through our economy and through the world economy. It just can't happen.
We did receive a downgrade at the time in our credit rating, but it was because we were on the brink. It didn't happen, but it got too close. The other thing I just want to say on the appropriations process, I would just differ with my friend Rodney a little bit on this. Look, the process is not working the way it's supposed to. Ordinarily, I agree. We should pass individual appropriations bills. The Senate should do the same. We should negotiate them one off. But I'll tell you, at the end of the year, there are actually about 26 people involved. I was one of the Cardinals, but I sat with my ranking member, and also then I sat with my Senate counterparts, and the four of us negotiated our bill, and that happened 12 times. So that happens, and then they all get married together in the omnibus. So yeah, look, if we don't do it more openly, you're right. It gives guys like me who are Cardinals a little bit more power, because I get to determine what goes in and what comes out, along with the other people at the table, the four corners. But I would argue that it's not the Senate that's driving that. We're kind of co-equal in that process. Now, the problem that we've had in the House is and at least on the Republican side, we had a whole bunch of members who wouldn't vote for appropriations bills. That was a problem, and that kind of weakened our leverage in some negotiations. And that was a problem for John Boehner too. We could talk a great game, but there's some guys who said, I will never, ever, 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 never vote for a debt ceiling. Well, okay, but they want to negotiate something. Well, but they're not going to vote for it. Who cares what they have to say? I mean, that's been the problem around there. We've taken a hell of a lot of advice and input from guys who won't vote for the bills. It's a mess.
Very, very true, Charlie. And on the approach process, it worked like that a year ago. I mean, Mario Diaz-Balart and other Cardinals will tell you they got a chance to negotiate. And unfortunately, because of the speaker's vote dynamics, nobody in the House negotiated this time. There were a lot of us, not a lot of us, there were a few of us who voted for the omnibus appropriations. I think we're in a better spot to get the approach process working and have House leverage. But are the Democrats going to want to work with the Speaker McCarthy to make the appropriations?
By the way, you're right that this most recent omnibus, House Republicans had no voice, but that was by their own choice. They chose not to negotiate. But the Senate did have more say, no doubt, but because the House Republicans chose not to participate. I mean, life's full of choices,
The Senate still had more say over that day. You
talked about the damage to, whether there's damage or not to the speaker's ability to kind of control what goes on in the House. And I think Charlie pointed to something that's really important, which is that Democrats will be able to use this sort of open rule process as a way they will try to hamstring the 18 or so Republicans who won in Biden districts. And so they will be offering amendments that are must vote yes for some of these members or no. And I think that that is what that can actually throw McCarthy's leadership into chaos, because you're going to end up losing a whole bunch of members who are in districts where they got to take those votes.
Excellent point. And Congressman Davis, if you could just address the scenario that Congresswoman Edwards had laid out, which you seem to agree with, which is, of course, we're not going to default, and there will be a deal with Democrats on the debt ceiling, and the 20 will go nuts. At that point, Congressman Davis, do you anticipate they would use their leverage of the motion to vacate, or will they just ask for some kind of baby concession and go away?
I would argue that Kevin McCarthy's speakership is stronger because of what he went through. The majority of our conference is more supportive of Kevin McCarthy than they ever have been right now. So if one of the 20 wants to use this as an attempt, I think there would be tremendous backlash,
Okay.
and make Kevin even stronger. And then it goes back to what Charlie and Donna both said about what kind of impact does this have on our majority makers? What kind of impact does this have on a Mike Lawler, a Mark Molinaro, an Anthony D'Esposito, these folks that have won Biden districts? And then if whatever happens to, inventing Santos, we never know if we're going to lose another seat in the majority. It makes it very difficult to operate. But keep in mind, if those difficulties come and you get unanimity on the Republican side, you know what you get? You get rules changes. No matter what agreement was made now, it can be changed. Just like when we were effective in the last 2 years, utilizing the motion to recommit process and making Democrats in tough districts do somersaults over themselves, they took away the motion to recommit. We couldn't even offer it. So rules changes can happen when you're more unified. And I would dare one of the 20 to try and take McCarthy out in a motion to vacate, because I think it would make him stronger and more able to negotiate those rules changes amongst those who want to govern.
Okay. Well, in this vein, do you believe that these people that you're talking about, Don Bacon, Brian Fitzpatrick, Mike Lawler, can utilize the discharge petition, which, by the way, is like a cumbersome process. It's not a lightning bolt in the pocket. It's not an easy fix. It's not designed to be that. In order to break with the majority and get something to the floor with Democrats. Maybe that's consensus moderate legislation that they feel will help them in the Biden districts they won, that they can't get through the Rules Committee because of the Freedom Caucus members. Maybe that's a spending deal. What do you, when you look at the discharge petition, do you see as something, they're talking about it, but do you see it as real leverage that can be used, or something that will become a litmus test for which they will be punished? If you're Mike Lawler, do you want to be on the discharge petition, or will you be primary?
Well, he's going to get primaried anyway for taking tough votes. I mean, that happens. It always does. I got primary for taking tough votes my freshman and my sophomore year, and you deal with that. But in the end, the discharge petition process can be a very effective tool. And we were very close on an immigration discharge petition. However, as somebody who spent 10 years in Congress and 6 in the majority, I never signed a discharge petition when I was in the majority. Never did.
I did.
And you know what? I saw the light when I was in the minority. I signed them all the time. So the key is going to be, how many Republicans can you get? Are there enough Charlie Dent who had a pen down at the well anytime a discharge petition came up when we were serving together? Or is there going to be a little more caution? And frankly, how can McCarthy leverage that anger of the governing Republicans to really take a hands-off approach to the discharge petition process? Those are the questions I think need to be answered.
Can I say?
I served in leadership in the minority, and I have to tell you, I mean, I think Democrats are going to be very disciplined in trying to figure out whether a substantial block of them go on to a discharge petition. And AB, as you said, it's a really difficult process. And if the Democratic leadership is saying to their members, stay away from that, then it's going to be, I mean, and then the Republican.
Oh, fascinating point.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's a disaster. And so it's just hard to see how effectively those members in those districts, that Democrats are going to allow them to get a win when they want to get a win in a general election.
That is, Charlie, that's an amazing point. It would only require 6 of those Republicans to join with the entire Democratic conference. But if the Democrats won't play ball, we're not going to see any discharge petitions.
But by the way, I only ever signed one discharge petition while I was in the majority, and we were successful. We were successful. It was the only time it had been done. It was on the Export-Import Bank in 2015.
Right.
And one other time it had happened on the BICRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, the McCain-Feingold, whatever they call it, which pays me in. So that was the other one. And I wasn't in for that one, but we did it. And let me tell you what, the reason why we did it and why we were successful is because a lot of us at that time, we had this group of like Freedom Caucus guys, 40 guys trying to blow up the process. They would use their 40 votes, leverage it to stop us from doing things. I remember I turned around and said, look, let's get the power of 40. In this case, it was the power of 42. And let's show them that, we can use our leverage too, to do something, to pass something that we thought was useful. It happened to be the Export-Import Bank. And we did it. And now it is a difficult process. The bill has to be out there for like 30 days or something. And you can only sign whenever you sign. And then it's complicated, but nevertheless, you can do it. I suspect on something like the debt ceiling, they may have to do it. If they're going to be, screwing around, for months on this, I can see, the Fitzpatricks, the Bacons, the Lawlers, and a few others saying, okay, enough. And they'll do it. And I don't think they'll be punished for it. Maybe someone will, I'm sure, look, you're going to get primary no matter what you do, I guess, these days. But, I used to stand up and say, we have to fund the government. I didn't get people in my district saying, boy, Dent, you're out of your mind. They said, hey, you're really good. You're not nuts. That was high praise. All right. Oh, you're not going to crash the economy. Boy, you're a normal human being. I mean, that's the kind of praise you get. They're not going to say you're terrific, but they just like the fact that you're not crazy. And if they think you're going to do things that are reckless, I think it's okay to push back, and you're not going to have the kind of pressure that many people think they're going to get. It's just not going to happen. There are a lot of normal people out there who don't want to, who just want to have a normal life and don't want to be disturbed by all the crazy stuff that goes on in Washington.
Okay, Charlie, just briefly before I ask you about immigration, I take Congressman Davis's point that overreaching on the part of the rebels could strengthen McCarthy, and he dares them to use the motion to vacate. But short of the motion to vacate, what incentives do the 20 have to back off of these fights? Right, the fights is what fuels them. It's what's created them and made them players. At this point, taking their toys and playing along, it does what for them? The small donations come in when they buck the establishment, right? What incentives do they have to calm down?
I don't know if they have a lot of incentives to calm down, to be perfectly honest. I always thought many of them just kind of were just naysayers, contrarians, rejectionists. They didn't really have an agenda, but boy, they get a hell of a lot of attention, when they make a
lot of money.
And I can't tell you how many times I got an Andy Biggs fundraising email during that whole speaker kerfuffle last week. I mean, they're raising money off this stuff, but I don't think that a lot of them have an agenda that they really want to advance, or they do have an agenda, but it's not something a majority of the Congress could ever support. Frankly, a whole lot of the Republicans couldn't support it, let alone the Democrats. So that's where I kind of draw the line on this. I don't think they have an agenda, and they have a tremendous amount of power to disrupt. I do think Kevin gave away way too much. I mean, surrendering your way to victory is not winning. I mean, in my view, I thought, they gave these guys a lot of stuff on the Rules Committee, gave 2 seats on the Appropriations Committee, all these promises on spending that they can't keep. I mean, I just thought there were a lot of giveaways, the motion to vacate the chair, all that stuff. They said, oh, this is always the rule, but we didn't have performative politics. So that was the rule until Mark Meadows came down in 2015 and decided he wanted to throw Boehner out. These guys were getting attention. I mean, that's why this is a problem. Should have never agreed to one vote. I mean, I just think it's crazy where we are.
Well,
okay. One thing that
with Democrats is that, for example, when Pelosi had issues with the squad plus whatever that number was, they wanted specific policy. It was a policy agenda, so she could sit down and like negotiate with them. It wasn't about, it wasn't really about being on television and all of that stuff. And I think that that is a difference with this group. And we talk about 20, but really we should talk about 5 of that 20. And so it's never needing the 20, it's just needing 5 of them. And there are at least 5 of them that are just renegades no matter what. And I don't know that there's something that they can be given or appeased. I don't know what else there is to give them as an incentive to stand down.
See,
Okay, Charlie, moving to immigration, this is one thing that unites the entire conference, the 20 and the rest. Do you see any path, given the Democratic Senate, to some kind of maybe even incremental progress on this issue? Certainly, there could be small changes. It's a question of whether or not they want to work with Democrats and get something signed into law. What is your view of whether or not there's a path for anything on immigration and security?
I always thought there was a path for something on immigration. You marry up border security with the Dreamers and maybe with cleaning up the agricultural visa program. There's some things that they could actually do that would be useful. Now, the problem, of course, that the House Republicans are going to face is that you enter into that type of negotiation, and Republicans will actually get some policy wins. That's not going to be enough for the hardliners. They're going to say this is a surrender and a capitulation. They always do. And they'll accuse everybody else of being a rhino and a squish and selling out, no matter what they get on border security. But the moment they do something on the Dreamers, and Republicans definitely want to do something on agricultural visas because many of them represent rural districts and they need workers, and we got to fix it for the farmers. But I think there's something there to do. The question is there a political capacity to do it? The last time immigration was brought up around, you remember in 2018, they went through, we had to do a Republican-only bill, which was a completely futile exercise. I mean, it was never going to become law because the Senate wasn't going to agree to it. I never quite understood the mentality. Oh, let's pass this Republican-only bill just to see it chopped up into pieces. And then when there is a real compromise that Rodney, you and I probably could have supported, it was never going to come to the floor. But that's what's the pressure is going to be on McCarthy to do something just with Republicans. And again, it'll be a futile effort, and it'll end up being a messaging bill and probably not a very good one.
Well, Congresswoman Edwards, I do want to say on a positive note that we have just been through a golden age of bipartisanship. I mean, if you had told me a year ago that we were going to see consequential, meaningful bills signed into law with the help of Senate Republicans on from CHIPS Act to PACT Act to first gun reform in 30 years to the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I would not. I mean, that BIF came first, but the rest of them in combination, and then the update to the Electoral Count Act. It is really quite impressive. So after slogging through the Obama administration and the Trump administration, to see this kind of consensus is really significant. Do you see, obviously we're in a new time here in this new Congress, any remaining opportunities for President Biden to have any bipartisan cooperation that could be signed into law?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one, AB. And I mean, when you really think about it, I mean, bipartisanship breeds bipartisanship. And so you could see that in the series of votes that took place over the last couple of years. But it's hard to envision something that even a deal that can be worked out on a range of things in the Senate that could also meet the muster of the House. And so I think that the Biden strategy now, to be quite honest, is what he did, sort of right after the election, which is go with Mitch McConnell to Kentucky and, look at a bridge. And I mean, I think that those kind of things, the implementation of this to demonstrate to the country what the end result is of bipartisanship will be the most that can happen here. Now, I mean, look, we're going to fund the government with Republican and Democratic votes. We're going to, eventually approve the debt ceiling with Republican and Democratic votes. but that's not substantive legislation in that respect. And so, no, I don't really expect that. I want to be more optimistic, but I don't think I am.
Maybe bipartisanship just comes when we least expect it. It's hard to anticipate it in this environment. I just want to ask the audience to remember to be submitting your questions using the Q&A function in the chat so that we can get to them soon. And Congressman Davis, I'm actually really excited about the bipartisan select committee on China, on our to leverage our competitiveness against Beijing. Congressman Mike Gallagher, who is an exemplary member, is going to be leading it. Do you think in this atmosphere, given what Donna has just described, that the Democrats and the Republicans on that committee are going to be able to come up with a strategy and potentially some kind of recommendations that could become legislation?
Well, first off, AB, I want to commend you for calling my good friend Mike Gallagher an exemplary member. It was clearly because I was his mentor when he.
Of course.
And now we're going to see that leadership and that mentorship come forward. But you know, I wasn't surprised by the bipartisan nature of support in the House last week to establish this select committee on China. And I think you're going to see bipartisanship in regards to that issue and that select committee. And it could show the American people what a true bipartisan select committee can do to advance America's interests, which should be all of our interests, Republican or Democrat. So in the end, though, I think what's going to overshadow the successes there are going to be the differences within the regular oversight environment that will encapsulate the entire House for the next 2 years. But as Donna said, there will be some successes. And I think if you look at what expectations can be set when it comes to a legislative agenda that doesn't get caught up in the talking heads on TV. You look at NDAA, you look at the Farm Bill. Farm Bill, I think, could pass and go to President Biden's desk. And then also, don't underestimate the ability to get something passed like an FAA reauthorization. If the Republicans stick to term limits for committee chairs, and Sam Graves has 2 years left, and there's nobody more dedicated to the aviation environment in this country than Chairman Graves. So I think you see an opportunity for bipartisanship there. But all of those things will not get the attention of the national news because why? Because it's Republicans and Democrats actually getting along, which is why I think they'll downplay the importance of bipartisanship on that select committee that my good friend Mike Gallagher is leading.
Well, Congressman, if you would, I think that the Farm Bill is a big deal. It's once every 5 years. Do you have the confidence that can be cobbled together in this environment?
Oh, absolutely, I do. And I think this environment actually makes it easier to do that. I helped to write 2 farm bills. As some of my colleagues on this call, like Sherry Bustos, was on the committee with me. And the Democrats were in the minority when we wrote these 2 farm bills. But in the end, the first one was a lot more bipartisan in the end. The second one was a little more bipartisan than others once it came back from the Senate. And you saw that support, and I think you'll see that again. But in the end, I think it's more apt to be bipartisan on the Farm Bill because Congress changed hands, because there is balance. If Democrats would have kept control, Chairman Scott and the Democrats, especially in their leadership, would have forced major changes to existing successful ag policy. They would have put a climate provision in every single agricultural title in the Farm Bill. That would have caused more partisanship. So I think now, kind of tweaking the status quo will lead to more successes in the ag sector.
Can I ask you quickly to weigh in on what you think the prospects for immigration and border security are in this environment, given what Congressman Dent said?
Absolutely zero. Remember, immigration is the one issue that I saw over my 10 years that both sides want to use as a political hammer and never want to solve. This could have been solved when President Obama had a 60-vote majority in the Senate, an overwhelming majority in the House. They chose to use it as an issue in 2012. And in the end, our last best chance was the compromise of Good Lot 1 and Good Lot 2 to fix the problem with the DACA recipients and dreamers. We could have done that, but partisanship ruled the day. Remember, we had 4 members of this group that helped negotiate what Charlie mentioned. It was border security, it was DACA, it was also, internal immigration issues and internal enforcement. Carlos Curbelo, Jeff Denham. Then they went up against, because Democrats said, we don't want any part of this now. They went up against having to negotiate with the sociopathic, narcissistic person like Mark Meadows. And in the end, no Democrats supported it. And not enough of us Republicans supported both measures. We could have done something so many times. And right now, with the border crisis that we see on the southern border and the Biden administration not doing close to near enough to stop it, there's absolutely zero chance that you get immigration reform.
Well, and Charlie mentioned the discharge petition on immigration, which came so close. But the reason that it didn't go anywhere was the politics, that there were Republicans who held off signing that discharge petition, which then meant that it couldn't come to the floor, just shy of that. And I think, Rodney is right. There's not really an incentive, frankly, for Republicans to do an immigration bill because it takes it off the political table. And that's, unfortunate for what we know needs to happen both at the border and overall in the system.
I want to ask Charlie, both of you, if you would like to each weigh in on the China committee and whether or not you believe that that could be the one oasis of bipartisanship where it behooves both parties to come together with some kind of strategy and a bill.
Yeah, I'm fairly encouraged, and I agree that Mike Gallagher is a terrific member and he'll do a good job. But there will be bipartisanship on this issue. My concern is that they do something that actually addresses the problem in a very meaningful way. That, I think China. I know. Look, for both sides, it's popular to go ahead and bash the Chinese. It's easy. But I think they have to almost be a little bit more nuanced, though, about how do we confront the Chinese, how do we cooperate with them when we must, and how do we compete, of course. And I think we got to be there's got to be a lot of nuance to this. I mean, I hear people say, we're gonna, and I'm all for onshoring and friendshoring, but we got to be smart too about decoupling, and we do need to decouple where it makes sense. But do we need to decouple when it comes to like this pen that might have been made in China? I mean, does that really affect national? Of course not. I mean, we just have to be a lot more, I think, targeted and strategic, and make sure whatever we do it in a way that doesn't escalate tension to the point that we can get into a real. I really worry about getting into a real conflict there. And this is going to be like the other wars we've been in lately. This is one where there can be some real casualties and losses of aircraft carriers and major ships and individual and of course personnel. So I think we got to be really smart about this, how we play the Chinese issues. But I'm encouraged there'll be a bipartisan approach. I'm just curious to see what the actual outcome is, and hopefully it'll positively affect the problem.
Okay, I would like all of you to weigh in. I'm going to start back with Congressman Davis about the likelihood of additional Ukraine funding being passed in the next 2 years, or whether or not the $45 billion that we just saw passed would be the last of it. Obviously, there's increasing resistance within the Republican, slightly the membership, certainly the base, to supporting the war against the Russians in Ukraine. Where do you see this going?
First off, it's not just Republican resistance. I think you're starting to see that alliance between the far right and the far left on issues such as Ukraine funding that will cause problems. There are very loud opposition on both sides, and they speak to the bases of each party. But in the end, I think reality and Ukrainian progress in defeating Vladimir Putin will energize enough Republicans and Democrats to continue to support the effort. The key is there's also got to be transparency. Ukraine needs answers to how they're successfully utilizing the $45 billion that they're getting or other tranches of dollars. And then what it does is it knocks away any chance at the far right and the far left from building a narrative. And I want to caution too, just going back to what Charlie mentioned about the Rules Committee, Freedom Caucus members being on the Rules Committee, et cetera, and other so-called agreements and appointments. The majority of the members of the Freedom Caucus were with Kevin McCarthy all 15 ballots, every single time. So it's not as though those small group of people, the Bob Goods of the world, are going to jump on and be somebody that can determine what every rules package looks like, or every rule on any bill looks like coming out of the Rules Committee. There are some very thoughtful people and people who want to govern that are within that Freedom Caucus too. And those are the types of members that I think you're going to see be a part of that process. And what that allows us to do is to pass must-pass legislation like future funding for conflicts like Ukraine.
Okay, Congressman Dent, why don't you weigh in if you want on that, but also address
Ukraine.
the Ukraine question for us?
Yeah, I mean, I for the life of me, and maybe this is why, you know, I'm out of step with the party, but hell, I thought it was America's strategic interest to keep the Russians down, in that, you know, Russia is doing everything within its power to undermine American power and influence in Europe, Middle East, and everywhere else. And here I feel like this is a bargain. We have these very motivated Ukrainians, you know, who are trying to stand up for democratic values, democratic with a small d, and they've got the will to fight, and they are, and they've exposed the Russian army to be rather hollow, and they're taking them down. And what could be more in America's interest than to weaken Russia, which is a threat to most of Europe right now? You know, hell, I still believe in NATO. I realize there's some folks who don't believe in it. You know, I thought, oh yeah, keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That was the whole point. Well, now we want to keep the Germans up more. The only thing that's changed, we want to keep the Russians out of Europe, and the Ukrainians are, you know, at whatever we're spending right now is a bargain. So I can't understand why there are folks in Congress, and frankly in this country, who think our interest is tied more to Russia and Putin and that ugly type of authoritarianism, which is now being exposed for the horrible form of governance that it is, not just in Russia, but in Iran and even in China with COVID. So, I mean, I think in some respects, these Ukrainians have, you know, done a lot to, you know, reinvigorate the talk about democracy, and we can win. So why not? And we're not spilling, not one American's been killed in this conflict. And I think I just, for the life of me, will never understand why there are some members of our conference who think we should be aligned with these types of authoritarian regimes in Russia, or that's where our future is. I don't see it. I'll never see it.
But Congressman, do you believe that, before I get to Congresswoman Edwards, Congressman Dent, just one last sentence here. So you believe that the Democrats will get together with 15 or 50 Republicans and pass any future requests for funding?
No, I think there'll be more than 15 Republicans. I think there'll be a whole lot of Republicans who want to support the Ukraine spending bill. I want to see how many won't support it. I hope they keep that number down.
Okay. Congresswoman Edwards.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I agree with that. I think that, you know, it's in the United States interest, and to the extent that there was some noise coming from the left, I know later in the summer, early fall, the Progressive Caucus put out, you know, a letter around negotiating and stuff that was quickly pulled back. And I think that element among Democrats has actually been largely put to bed. And I would expect that both in the Senate and the House that there's going to be strong bipartisan support for Ukraine, as there should be. I mean, we have to keep in mind that Russia's goal isn't just about Ukraine. It's about reconstituting the Russian Empire. And he isn't going to stop unless he's stopped. And Ukraine is just a proxy for the rest of what he wants to do in the region. And it's in the United States interest. And I think to the extent that we have to shore up and keep our NATO allies on the program is part of our responsibility, and continuing to give Ukraine the kinds of supplies and advanced equipment that they need in order to be able to be successful. And I do think that while there's been some fall off in support for the Ukraine war effort, that for the most part, Americans understand what's at stake.
Okay, we're going to move now to audience questions. My problem is I'm not seeing any at the chat.
Go to the Q&A.
I saw them loading, but
Want me to read them?
Yeah.
Okay. Congresswoman Bustos thank you for joining us. She's asking Congressman Davis and Congressman Dent, because of their close relationships with the chairs of the committees, who would you point to as the most bipartisan chairs who'll be able to try to bring Democrats into the conversation with votes across the aisle?
Go ahead, Charlie. I'll clean up after you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a guy like Sam Gray's been around a while. I mean, I think he could do something like you said earlier, Rodney, on aviation. I served on that committee. I think Sam's somebody you could work with. Kay Granger at Appropriations, I know her quite well. And, I think that she and, Rosa DeLaura had the capacity to work together. I saw Kay and Nita Lowy when those two worked very well together. I don't know that the relationship between Kay and Rosa is as strong as that one was, but it's still, I think, good. And they can certainly move appropriations bills. And I'd have to think about, who these committee chairs are, but, and there's some new ones. So, I mean, I would just look at those two right now, appropriations and probably transportation jump out at me immediately. And I'm sure there are others, but just haven't given enough thought.
Yeah, the ones that aren't bipartisan are the oversight committees. I mean, judiciary is not going to be bipartisan. Neither is oversight and government reform with Jamie Comer, even though Jamie is a pretty bipartisan guy. He's going to do what his committee members want him to do as chair, and those are where the fights are going to be. But you look at the committees that Charlie mentioned. Sam Gray's leading T&I, working with Rick Larson. I think, Sherry, that could be back to where we saw the bipartisanship under Bill Schuster that I didn't see under Chairman DeFazio. I was frankly disappointed by that. You look at committees like Armed Services, where I think Mike Rogers and Adam Smith have an already established working relationship. G.T. Thompson on agriculture. GT is going to be he's going to be the type of leader that we need, a quiet, effective leader that has a good team that's willing to find that principled compromise. I don't think you're going to see much bipartisan success on ed and workforce and some of the other committees, but don't underestimate where you can find wins on committees like science with Frank Lucas and Zoe Walker. And even though she was a partisan hack on Committee on House Administration when she was the chair of my committee, she's not going to be there. Brian Stile, who's going to lead House Administration, and Joe Morelli, they can really do some good things to bring about good bipartisan morale on that campus if they're given the chance to work together, which they will be. So some of those committees, other committees that I think that you could look at would be, Foreign Affairs. McCall and Meeks are always going to be together on the major issues that affect the United States of America. So those are the successes I think you can look forward to.
Yeah, by the way, just follow up. I agree about McCall at Foreign Affairs, Rogers at Armed Services. I think he'll work very well. And I've seen Lucas do some things on a bipartisan basis over the years. He's very effective when he was on Ag as chairman. And then he helped us orchestrate that whole discharge petition, frankly, back in 2015. So, I mean, I think you're right, Rodney. Those ones you mentioned would all, be very good at entering the bipartisan agreements with their Democratic counterparts.
It's so interesting because the committees that you mentioned are also committees that if you look back historically, especially over these last, few decades, have been committees where there has been bipartisanship. So if you look at transportation and science and foreign affairs, I mean, these are always committees where there had been historically been bipartisanship, and they now at least have chairmen who have those kind of relationships.
Okay, we have another question. This is from Nick Lampson asking for advice for business folks who are involved with economic activity in Central American countries, which would create jobs and assist in relieving some of the pressure on our southern border. Sanctions are presently holding up speaking and working with people who want to promote friendship with the US. And I'll open that. I'm going to go to Congresswoman Edwards first, and then to Congressman Dent, and then to Congressman Davis.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a real failure. We don't have a Central American policy. I mean, we have some resources that are going into Central America, but that doesn't form a policy that then allows the kind of investment both public and private investment that is actually going to be necessary to relieve the pressure on immigration, to stave the drug trade and the violence. And sadly, it will mean that the administration would have to work with Congress in order to be able to relieve some of those pressures.
The only thing I would add is that it seems to me that Latin America has been, in terms of foreign policy, somewhat ignored by the U.S. And I think we need to re-engage in that part of the world more than we have, because the Chinese are there and making a real impact. And so I think we have to start thinking about, America's role in the world, particularly as it relates to the global South, not just Latin America, but sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, where many people think we're kind of out of the game or not as involved as we ought to be. And I think that's especially true in our own hemisphere right now. So I can't sit here on this call and tell you I have the answer to this question, but I think we have to develop a lot more direct engagement with that part of the world than we have up to this point.
We certainly do, and we should. But in the end, as everybody on this call knows, when the debate becomes about fiscal restraint, the easiest part to go after first is foreign affairs funding to other countries. But there are a few other dynamics in play when it comes to Latin America. Remember, some of the countries are led by leaders that have tremendously terrible human rights records. And when you're thinking about Maduro, you're thinking about Ortega, those issues matter, especially in a close Congress like this, where you're not going to see a willingness to want to even negotiate with those leaders and thus those countries. But there's also something I learned in my time dealing with the country of Cuba. At some point, there's a lot of rhetoric about how they want to have economic activity with the United States of America. But as I found throughout my tenure in Congress and even before that, there comes a time when you call their bluff and you realize when given the opportunity, they don't want to be engaged with the United States of America. So that's where I think, is kind of a dynamic at play in certain parts of Central America, certain parts of Latin America that doesn't get enough attention about their willingness when push comes to shove. When America's ready, are they going to be ready?
Well, which is why we have to figure out a way around. I mean, so the Cuban government, for example, may not be ready. The Cuban people actually are. And so, and I think the same is true for these Central American countries, which is why the United States strategy has been, getting resources going around the government entities into communities. But the reality is that you have to have government cooperation for so much of this stuff to work that's actually going to make a difference. But we have to, because the pressure that we're facing, particularly from the triangle countries, is really it constrains us. It's dictating our domestic policy, and and not to have some solutions that will work will not relieve that pressure. And there could be a way to, I think, rethink the sanctions regime when it comes to investment in Central America.
Okay, I want to get to a question that somebody asked about these FY22 spending limits. We have not discussed defense cuts, and I'm going to start with Congressman Davis. What do you anticipate in terms of trying to get to a template that meets the goals that Speaker McCarthy promised it would, whether or not you anticipate that will involve cuts to the Pentagon? What do you see going down with this? This is sort of I've looked for tea leaves everywhere in the last week, and it seems to be people are talking out of both sides of their mouth on this issue.
Well, reality is going to sink into a lot of House members that we can pass anything we want out of the House, or they can pass anything they want out of the House. Sorry, I still haven't been transitioned off of Congress enough to start saying they instead of we. But they're going to be very surprised when the Senate actually has a say in what gets passed and signed into law. You're going to see a lot of debate at the Appropriations Committee process about constraint. And that happens in every Republican-led House. But in the end, they're going to have a choice. Are they going to want to take a little less of what they demand, or are they going to want to continue with a CR that will decimate the United States military, that will decimate border security funding, the things that they say they're for? Those are decisions that they're going to have to make, and decisions that I'm glad they're going to get to make. Because if Kevin McCarthy wasn't Speaker and we were still going through this process, nothing would happen in Washington right now, because we wouldn't even have a House that would have been that would have actually been organized, let alone operational.
And Congressman Dent, what do you anticipate in terms of cuts to the military?
I don't think they're going to happen because, and this, look, that they're going to have to reach a spending agreement. They'll have to negotiate this. Ordinarily, the budget committee should do it, but I'm going to offend somebody, but I always felt the budget committee is the most useless committee in Congress because it really doesn't do what it's supposed to do. But so the leaders will negotiate an overall spending agreement for defense and non-defense spending, and that will be entered into by House and Senate, and there's going to be an agreement. And then, of course, predictably in the House, some on the far right in the House caucus said, well, we just want to pass the defense bill and we'll do a continuing resolution for the rest. Well, there's the Senate again, and they're not stupid. And, they're not going to release a defense bill without doing Labor H and the other bills. So, I mean, that's how this is going to work. So you're going to have an agreement where defense will get whatever it's going to get, but it won't be the 2022 level. I know that. And non-defense will be probably negotiated at a level similar to what the increase will probably be similar to defense, probably, not definitely, given all the spending the Democrats just did, with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, Republicans have a legitimate case to make that, we don't have to increase discretionary non-defense spending by as much, given those increases they receive. So, but nevertheless, they'll come to an agreement, and then that will be that. But again, that far right fringe is going to be very disappointed when they see what's on the menu.
But Congressman Dent, just briefly, does the initial blueprint that they propose and McCarthy, permits include defense cuts? I understand in the end they're not going to get what they want.
Yeah.
But are they? I mean, Jim Jordan is making very clear that everything's on the table, and he thinks that if he de-wokes the military, somehow he's going to find the necessary savings.
Well, what will happen in the House, in all likelihood, they will pass appropriations bills at a number that is not agreed to. In other words, they won't have an agreement on the number, so they'll write the bills to these imaginary numbers, knowing that they'll never become law. So maybe some guys can say, I voted for all these spending bills at the 2022 level on a partisan basis. I don't know they'll get out of the House, but they'll try to pass those, and they'll send them to the Senate. And then again, we know what the final agreement is going to be. So I could see the House just passing the bills at whatever numbers they want to pass them at. And then, but it doesn't mean anything unless there's an agreement. So it'll just be performative and more of a messaging exercise. But again, it raises expectations for those guys in the far right. They're going to be, deeply disappointed when the real bills come back in the form probably of an omnibus.
Congresswoman Edwards, we have a couple of questions that I want to end, that I'm going to combine, and that I want to end with and have everyone weigh in on this because it's important. These are questions about why bipartisanship is so hard to obtain. What steps can citizens take to try to foster it? And how do we overcome the stranglehold that our primaries have on our elections? And how much each election seems to whittle down the number of moderate members who come to the Congress wanting to find bipartisan solutions and work across the aisle. So I want to start with you. I'm sure you get this question all the time. I get it all the time. It is the most important question in so many ways. And we don't want our fellow citizens to be discouraged. We want them to know that they're not powerless. They have their vote, and they should be interacting with their members and encouraging bipartisanship and rewarding it. What is your take about primaries, and as a member, what can you tell people about why on the inside it is difficult to work across the aisle?
Well, I mean, look, I think that the challenge that we have around bipartisanship actually begins outside of Congress and state legislatures that are drawing lines for congressional districts. It really is just that profound that, because the exercise of drawing congressional districts is in itself political. The Supreme Court said that it makes it really difficult when so many districts are so solidly either Democratic or Republican, and then that plays out in the policy process when you get to Congress and that there's not a political price that will necessarily be paid in your district, then you can be more entrenched. And the incentive for bipartisanship is just not there. On the other hand, I do think that people do still have a voice and that it matters. And that, when simple things like phone calls and letters, start coming into offices, there are enough members who pay attention to that, even if I'm not talking about those who are like way on either of the extremes, but when you have the extremes, it means that there are actually a lot of people in the middle. And so I do think it matters, but it's hard. And there are things that you can find where bipartisan work gets done and it doesn't make the headlines. And I think that's really frustrating. I know that, as former members, when we go out and we speak to, college students and campuses, their experience of Congress is whatever they see on C-SPAN or whatever they see on the news, but it's not the real experience of Congress. And I think Rodney and Charlie pointed to this earlier, that there are some of these committees and, historically where people have worked together on science, on transportation, on foreign affairs, around armed services. And so there are those opportunities, but they're never going to make the headline. So let's stop expecting that. And all of us want to see more bipartisanship, but there are policy differences, and part of democracy is about, going through those policy differences.
Congressman Davis.
Yeah, primaries, I had no idea they could affect the outcome of a governing Republican versus one who's not. But Donna's right. Look at what happened here in Illinois. It was a partisan remap process that led to a much more partisan Illinois congressional delegation. And so when our Democratic governor stands up to complain about partisanship in Washington, I certainly hope Democrats across the country say, hang on, you had a role in that. And in the end, redistricting has an impact. And what's going to stop that? I don't know. There's got to be some bipartisan efforts to say, let the states do what the states want to do, but let's ensure that we put a fair map process in place in as many states as possible. But keep in mind, America is becoming more polarized. For what Donna and Charlie have said, for a large part of it is that only the conflicts get covered. That's all they see in the news media, the national news media, which drips down into how local media is covered, and then also in social media coverage. It's always about the fights. We are not going to see the bipartisan agreement on addressing the China problem in this country on the nightly news and in the national headlines. It will always be about Republicans fighting Republicans, Democrats fighting Democrats, or Republicans and Democrats fighting each other. That's a problem that leads to a very frustrated, large group of voters. You mentioned Ukraine earlier, AB. I ran in a district that I thought I knew very well. I went from an even district to an R+22. I should have known. And I went to areas of Illinois that I thought were areas made up of governing Republican primary voters. And I was shocked how many people did not agree with Charlie, me, and Donna that Russia is an aggressor, that we always stand up for democratically elected nations. I was surprised by that. But the Democrats have that problem in their own base. And those base voters are what's making the primaries more important, because the districts that governing Republicans run in now have become more R22s like I had to deal with, which pushes their voting base, and it pushes their constituent interaction further to the far ends of the political spectrum.
Congressman Dent, we actually have two submissions that I want to get to. One, former Congressman Mike Capuano, thanks for joining us. He makes a great comment that partisanship is really being amplified by average moderate voters not participating in primaries. And I urge every single audience I ever speak to vote in primaries, because if we flooded them with voters who wanted cooperation, we would get more of it. Thank you so much, Congressman Capuano, for that. So Congressman Dent, we also have a great question from Congressman Mike Bishop. This is really interesting, and I'd like you to address it. Should there be an immediate review of the continuity of government in the event that something, God forbid, would have happened to the vice president or the president while Congress had not been sworn in and the speaker was not elected? How would we have resolved the succession of the presidency? Did you think of anything last week watching this, Congressman Dent, that made you concerned about that process?
Yeah, it did, and I appreciate Mike's question. The speaker vote typically is the easiest vote one should be casting during a session, not the hardest. And I think it really speaks to a dysfunction, within our government, that we couldn't agree who was the third in line. At least the Republicans couldn't come to an agreement among themselves. And I think Mike's question is fair. What if there had been a real crisis going on, that the vice president or the president had been incapacitated, maybe for a health reason or some other reason? I think that would be very sobering. And I'm not sure what we should do about it, other than it really gets down to the people in the government. We can all fuss about the rules. I hear it all the time. I always got kind of tired and bored by these rules debates, frankly. Same thing with the Senate about the filibuster. I happen to think it's useful. It's overused, but it's useful. But it's not about those rules. It's about the people. If people who come to Congress don't have an affirmative sense of governance, if they think they're there really just to say no and stop everything, including electing your leaders, well, then we got problems. And I'm not sure what changes we would need to make to the presidential succession, but I mean, it really gets down to the members of Congress being very sober. I mean, maybe I hate to say it, but it takes a massive crisis sometimes to focus the mind. As partisan as things have been, I mean, I voted for TARP. That was no fun. I mean, I hated when we had a financial crisis. I'll tell you what, that was probably the hardest time I had while serving in Congress. I mean, because something was happening outside of my control, but I had to do something to fix it. And it wasn't always easy to understand the problem or how to fix it. And I think that, I think we need more members who come in with the attitude that they're there to fix problems and to keep the train running, just to keep the wheels of government moving. That's it. But if you're coming there to blow it up, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for Mike, unfortunately.
AB, I do want to commend to people. I participated in a bipartisan committee on the continuity of government led by the American Enterprise Institute, and we actually just released our report and recommendations to Congress on the continuity of government.
Fascinating. Well, amen. I hope that everyone who comes through the Congress takes seriously the protection of the institution. And I know that the three of you always did. This has been a really stimulating and edifying conversation. I so appreciate the participation of the three of you on this panel and the audience members who tuned in. Thank you to former members for having me. It's always my honor and pleasure. Happy Friday, everybody.
We didn't even talk about George Santos. That's great.
There you go. Good point.
All right. Thank you, everybody.